and I'll begin by discussing tips for successful metrics programs and also describe some common pitfalls that I've run into over the years. And that will be the more kind of theoretical part of what I talk about. But what I know what you want to see are more tangible, specific examples. So I'll move from there to specific KPIs or key performance indicators that are in use today by actual legal departments. And then I also have some survey data to share with you from a survey that we did in partnership with CLOC about 6 months ago. And for those of you not familiar with CLOC, the acronym stands for Corporate Legal Operations Consortium. And they have a large membership of law department operations professionals who are interested in managing the business of law more effectively, more efficiently. So they were a good group for us to draw on for a survey on the subject of metrics. And then I want to make a distinction and show the relationship between the concept of metrics versus analytics. And demonstrate for you how the results that you might see from metrics might naturally lead you to a question that you need to answer, and show you how a flexible analytics tool, such as the one that we have at CounselLink, can help you efficiently find the answer to such a question. And our analytics tool is highly visual, so this is just a brief kind of preview of the sorts of views of information that I'll provide for you within that demo. And then lastly, if time permits, I want to discuss how benchmark metrics fit into the broader topics of metrics and management of the legal department. So that's what we're going to cover today, and I'll go ahead and jump right in and get started talking about metrics. And as I said, I want to begin by sharing some best practices about what it takes to implement a successful KPI program. So I'm going to talk about a few different things here. The first one, I think this is the most important, is that establishing KPIs has to begin with an articulation of your objectives and the specific initiatives that you're planning within your legal department in order to achieve those objectives. Now, there is certainly lots of crossover for many of you in terms of your department's objectives. We realize that, but to some degree, every department is somewhat unique, so you have to take that time to examine what's important to your department and what may be unique in terms of what you want to be measuring. So we believe at CounselLink that there are metrics that are applicable to every legal department without question, and I'm going to share examples of those metrics with you shortly. But then there are other metrics that have to be specific to what's important to your department and more broadly to your corporation. So I'll also be sharing specific examples of those unique sorts of objectives that I've heard about and the KPIs that support those objectives. All right, the next point that I want to make is that metrics fall into categories. These three different they support three different objectives. So within these categories of financial control, outcomes, and or risk management, I've kind of lumped those two things together, although you could arguably break them out. And then the third category is operational efficiency. And if you think about these three different categories, most common metrics are around the first, right? They're around financial control. But unless cost management is the only thing that's important to your legal department, and I highly doubt that it is, you really should have metrics that relate to all three of these categories, and that's the balance. There's certainly a challenge in finding the right metrics to support those other two categories. And then in addition to these three groupings that I have, some departments may have very specific initiatives that don't fall neatly into one of these categories. So you may want to still include a metric related to that objective. And the best example I can give that I hear about more and more lately is diversity. If managing the diversity of your outside counsel and perhaps your in-house team is an important objective of the organization, then you want to have a metric around that, and it's not going to fall into one of these categories. All right, a couple of other points here. One is leading and lagging indicators. So metrics can be one of these two different things, and they, in a good program, will have both of them within it. And probably the best way for me to speak to this bullet point is to give an example. So the best example of a lagging indicator of performance is outside counsel spending, right? What did I spend? You've already spent it. You can't change it. You can't control it. It's a lagging metric. A leading indicator might be something like the number of new matters that are being opened up within your department. That's a leading indicator of a number of things, including perhaps what you might spend. It may be a leading indicator of the amount of risk within a particular area as well. Right, so that's leading and lagging indicators. And the rest of these, I'm not going to go through them all with you in the interest of time and keeping your attention. But I do want to address the fourth one, that you don't want to have too many metrics in a good KPI program. The programs that I've seen most successful include somewhere between, I'd say, 6 and 10 overall metrics for the department. And that's not to say that you're limiting what you're measuring to 6 to 10 things. You may cascade down to your different practice areas and have 6 to 10 metrics in each practice area, some of which might be the same. Likely they will be, but some of them may be unique to that practice area. But for each entity that you're measuring, to have 6 to 10 metrics is about the right number from my perspective. And if you think about it, there are many things that I'm sure that many of you want to measure, but there's just not enough time in a day, to measure everything that you want to. So you need to focus on what's really critical and what's really going to move the dial for you in terms of meeting your objectives. And I think the other things that are on this slide speak for themselves, but I'm happy at any point during our discussion today, if you want to ask about something I haven't spoken to on a given slide, happy to answer those questions. And before I move to talking about some of the specific examples of metrics that I told you I bring to this webinar, I do want to take a minute to emphasize how critical it is that you have good data. No matter what system you're using to capture the data, when you're configuring that system, you should be thinking about ways that you will want to extract the information, report on it, analyze it in more granularity. And specifically, these kind of two buckets that I have here, if you think about matter classifications, these are the way that you classify your matters is among the most, I think, important decisions that you're going to make for purposes of KPIs and the supporting analytics. So for instance, if you have matter types that are too granular, there's going to be confusion about which of them should be selected, and likely some bad decisions that are made and some bad data that comes out of the system. We've also seen some legal departments who are doing things like systematically identifying extraordinary sorts of matters so they can either exclude them from their reporting or analytics, or maybe isolate them in their analytics. And they can only do that if they flag them in some way. The third bullet as well is something that we're seeing more law departments doing is assigning complexity levels to matters, because that may affect how you want to analyze that information. And then the second grouping here I'll touch on relates to enforcing consistent billing. And this may seem basic, but I'm sure that many of you, if you're using any sort of enterprise legal management system, be it CounselLink or any other one, you've probably run into reporting challenges where you see a fixed fee that's been billed as if it's an hourly invoice, and it skews all of your calculations of hourly rates. And monitoring the data to prevent these sorts of issues kind of falls into what I refer to as data hygiene. And I think that you should be setting up processes to prevent those data problems, first of all. But you can't always, so where you can't, to make sure that you have a process to periodically look back and correct any of those data problems that may be causing anomalies within your data set. And then very briefly, I'll just address the first bullet here. And I've already alluded to this in one of the previous slides. You're not going to win at your metrics program by having more KPIs than another legal department. That's not the goal. And related to that, if you're discussing a potential metric or a metric that you've chosen with somebody within your legal department, a manager, practice group leader, your general counsel, or whoever it may be, and their answer to that, their response to your discussion of that KPI is, well, that's interesting. That's probably not enough to make it a KPI, right? If it's just interesting, they need to be able to answer the question of what would you do with this information in order to improve the value that the legal department delivers. And if it doesn't help lead to some sort of improvement or help tell them what they might do, it likely does not belong as part of your KPI program. Okay, so with that, I do want to begin and start talking about some specific metrics. And I mentioned when I began that there are metrics that I believe can apply to all legal departments. And I've started that list here. It's not an all-inclusive list, but I think it's a good set that should be relevant to everybody that's on this call. And I'll briefly walk through each of these. The first one is it's a measure of the total legal department cost. Now that speaks for itself. There's always a metric. There's a budget, right, that sets the goal for what this metric is. So I think everybody on this call can see the relevance of that. The second metric relates to matter level budgeting. So whether you set matter budgets only for certain matters or for all of your matters, you should be measuring how accurate actual spending is relative to those budgets. The third metric that I list here would be metrics related to law firm performance. These tend to be subjective scores, right, that you gather, that you ask people within your legal department to evaluate, to quantify what the level of satisfaction is across a number of different things related to how that law firm worked with you. And then you can gather that information periodically either at the law firm level, perhaps you could score it at the matter level and then aggregate it up to the law firm level. There are multiple ways that you could capture that information. The fourth item relates to assessing outcome satisfaction for individual matters. And I don't just mean outcome in terms of categories like did you win a case or settle a case. And I think there's a degree of satisfaction with the outcome that you should be assessing for at least a portion of the legal work that you have. And then the fifth item here measures your ability to provide forecasts. It's accurate forecast information and accrual information to your finance partners. I think that's important to every legal department that I've worked with. And then the last metric relates to headcount. And I think this is familiar to many of you. There are lots of benchmarks around headcount sorts of metrics. There are probably many of these that you're already capturing, the sorts of ratios that are fairly common within our industries. And again, I'm not suggesting that this is a complete set of metrics. I think there are other ones that are relevant to everybody, but I think it's a good place to start in terms of thinking about metrics that are going to be important for you. And now I want to turn to unique metrics that I've seen used as KPIs, again, key performance indicators, by specific customers that I've worked with. And these are unique. And so I'm not talking about things that I think are relevant to all of you, but I want to emphasize the point that depending on what your objectives and specific initiatives are, you may very well have some unique needs for metrics within your KPI program. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of these. I'm not going to go through this whole list, though, as I said before, I'm happy to speak to any of them if you would like me to give some more information about an example that I've listed here. And I'll start with the third one that's on this list. And the objective says, reduce case assessment period. So this objective was specific to a client that I worked with in their litigation group within their legal department. And the VP of litigation in this group had done some analysis that demonstrated a pretty strong correlation between how long the case assessment period lasted and the overall costs of the case. So they chose to measure the number of days it took to complete the case assessment phase, and that was a leading indicator, sort of KPI for their group. So it's an example of a metric that doesn't apply to every legal department and every group within every legal department, but it did come from somebody who has spent considerable time contemplating leading indicators of performance. So that's a leading indicator of what total spending might result to be within their group. And then the other metric I thought I'd mention on this list is the second one from the bottom, where the objective is to improve turnaround time to the business. Now, this one relates to internal matters that were handled by this particular legal department. So in addition to tracking overall cycle time for these internal sorts of matters, this legal department tracked the number of times that matters bounce back and forth between the business and the legal department. So for them, that was their leading indicator of cycle time. And it also, one of the benefits of this metric for them is that it provided, really actionable information. So if the results, if the number of times that the matters came back was higher for a particular business area or with certain in-house lawyers, perhaps it's a communication issue, or perhaps there's a process that can be defined or improved in order to reduce the number of times that matters were bouncing back and forth. So those are unique examples. And again, I recognize that these aren't going to be meaningful to all of you, but hopefully it's food for thought in how you determine what's critical for you. And note that I've listed on the right-hand side the metric type. So I talked about those 3 different categories of metrics: financial control, outcomes, and risk management, or efficiency. Again, the key is to have a balance across those different areas, and I wanted to make sure that I gave you examples that fell into each of those categories. And then I've got a few more examples, and then these are based on objectives that I hear fairly frequently. So these kind of fall in between. The first set of metrics I showed you are ones that I think are relevant to everybody. The second set were really quite unique to some very specific objectives. But then these are not entirely unique, but they probably won't apply to all of you. And again, I've listed the objectives that I've heard, and then I've listed several metrics that could be used to assess whether that objective, each of those objectives, is being met. And just to be clear, if one of these objectives was a priority for you, the best practice would be to select one metric that is the best proxy for assessing how you're performing relative to that objective. While I've listed multiple metrics to give you a sense of how many different ways you can go about measuring something, I'm not suggesting that you should have this many metrics in your program. Okay, in the interest of time, and I don't want you to kind of glaze over and looking at all these metrics, I'm not going to walk through each of these or any of these, but again, if there's one that you want me to address or several, I'll be happy to speak to those if you want to put a chat into the webinar window. So I'll turn now to the output of the survey that we did in partnership with CLOC. About 6 months ago, we had the opportunity to survey the membership of CLOC about their use of metrics. And we had a list of 15 metrics that you can see listed here, and we asked the members to evaluate 3 things about each of those metrics. One is, how important is this metric to your management? Secondly, how satisfied are you with your ability to report on that metric? And then third, how automated is your reporting process relative to that metric? So what you're looking at here is the answer to how important they rated these metrics. So you can see that the average score, which is that black line kind of running down vertically, the average score for all of the metrics was 7.3. And each of the metrics averaged above a 5. So clearly, they're saying that all of these metrics are important. But the metrics that are of most importance are not surprising. I'm sure you'd agree, or most of you would probably agree. And you can see that the top 6 metrics, we've color-coded them. The red ones are all financial sorts of metrics. So this, it goes back to my point earlier about how frequently we think of a metric as being financial in nature. Yet, I think it speaks to and reinforces the need for legal departments to include metrics related to outcome management and risk management and efficiency within the legal department. Okay, in terms of satisfaction with the ability to report, the average score, again, that black line, vertical line here, the average score was below a 5. So you'll recall it was a 7.3 on the previous slide. So not surprisingly, the satisfaction with reporting, being able to report on these metrics, is lower than how important the legal department operations leaders think they are. And the metrics that they are most satisfied with reporting are, again, the financial metrics. And I think that this begs the question of whether the industry is really saying that what is more important to measure is also what happens to be easier to measure, because we have that data available, especially within enterprise legal management systems. But part of our goal, at LexisNexis, at CounselLink, as vendors to the industry, is to make it easier to measure some of the other types of metrics and to speak as often as we can about the importance of measuring those things. So you'll certainly hear more from us about the non-financial metrics and ways that we think that they can be measured and should be measured. All right, and then this scatter chart, I won't spend much time here, but it was another way of looking at the relationship between importance and satisfaction. So those two things are highly correlated. If you think something is important, your satisfaction with reporting on it is close, is high. But you can see that there are a few dots that are labeled, the ones that are below the line, that are further below the trend line. So they're not as closely correlated. So what that's telling us is that there's a greater degree of dissatisfaction in being able to report on satisfaction with law firms, on cycle time, and matter outcome satisfaction. So there's definitely room to improve in terms of the ability to report on some things that are considered important within the industry. And then finally, related to automation for reporting of these metrics, you see all of these have even lower scores now, so my average is lower, and indeed the individual scores are lower as well. So not surprisingly, if you look at the top, something like outside counsel spending is pretty highly automated. But in the gathering of metrics for some of the things toward the bottom of this chart, you know, diversity, outcome satisfaction, reporting on those things tends to be still a bit more manual. So being able to get more efficient in how we're reporting on things that are important is certainly a goal that we share with you. And then we've included just a few direct quotes that came out of that survey. So in addition to collecting those data points, we collected some feedback from those that responded, and it includes, you know, things about being able to more easily surface information, have more customizable tools, have more dashboards and sorts of visual tools and ad hoc tools. So I would assume that many of you share these perspectives. If there are other things that you wish that ELM providers would do to support metrics, we are certainly always interested in hearing that. All right, so I'm going to do a demonstration. So I'm actually going to pause my screen for a moment, and I'm going to go into the CounselLink application. So bear with me. I'm sure that many of you have dealt with the pain of trying to do a live demo before. I'm going to be optimistic that this works out. But my goal here is to show you how metrics tie into analytics. And I think that the two things get lumped together fairly often in conversations. But there really is an important distinction between analytics and metrics. I'm going to show my screen again, and Megan, I'll trust that you'll let me know if for some reason this is not coming through on the webinar. But I'm going to go ahead and go into a dashboard that we have set up within CounselLink, and this is using kind of demo data. So just be aware that the data is dummy data and not necessarily meaningful to what your organization's output might look like. So metrics provide a data point, right, that can often lead to questions. And if you have a flexible analytics tool, you can easily, on the fly, answer those questions and do so in a visual way that's both compelling in terms of how you can present the information and helps to explain the story more easily, which is what a good graph should be able to do. So looking at this data here, look, this dashboard, I'll just briefly speak to what's included here. This is a standard CounselLink dashboard that very simply breaks down how much has been spent by a given legal department. So you can break it down by year, by matter type, by law firm, however you might want to slice and dice that information. Fairly straightforward data on the top, showing some information about how much was saved by system adjustments and discounting and things of that nature. But so I'm going to just give an example. So say my legal department has a key performance indicator. One of my metrics is about managing outside counsel spend, and I've set a target that I don't want to exceed my prior year levels. Well, in this case, you can see that for this law firm, they've actually spent less in 2016 versus 2015, but perhaps my general counsel says to me, but I know that's not the case. You know, I've heard of a lot of increases across many of our areas. Is there, while the numbers may show that, that overall I shouldn't be concerned, is there an area I should perhaps be paying more attention to? So that would lead to a number of different paths that could be taken to address that question. I think a natural path would be to focus on matter types, to look at these different practice areas and see where changes are occurring, or perhaps increases in what's being spent. So I just expanded or made a full size of that quadrant of my dashboard. And then I'm just going to manipulate this a little bit to show you that the way that my matter types are defined is that they're pretty granular, right? So I've got all these, I've got different levels of IP. I've got IP litigation, IP patent, trademark, and other. I should be ashamed of myself, as I said before about data hygiene, that apparently I have matters that come into my system that don't even have a matter type. Certainly does not lend itself to being able to analyze data well. But so look, given the fact that I have too much, I've got a lot of granularity, I think that it would benefit me to be able to look at this at a slightly higher level, at a level that's more meaningful to my practice group leaders. So I've just made a little bit more information available to myself here, and I'm going to replace these matter types with a higher level. So I'm going to replace them with what we call matter type level 1. So now it's rolled up some of those matter types that were more granular into a smaller number, something that's a little bit more manageable for me to be able to analyze. And then I want to look at trends, right? So we saw that in that dashboard originally that overall my outside counsel spending is down a bit from prior year, but let's take a look at it within each of these higher level matter types. So I'm going to also put the year as a row here. So now I've got bucketed each of my matter types, and I can see the trend. I can see the trend by year. So I can see that that overall downward trend seems to be driven by intellectual property, but I do have a couple of areas where I have an increase, employment over here, and M&A as well. And because in this example, 2014 is probably the year that I started using CounselLink, I don't really need to look at it. It's going to noise on my screen. So I can easily remove 2014 from my data, and now I'm just looking at those 2 years that are a more meaningful comparison to me. And I can do, you know, in a tool like this that gives me the flexibility and the ease in trying to visualize what I'm looking at. Perhaps I would also want to, you know, use different colors. So here it kind of points to the fact that employment and M&A are the areas that have an increase in spending. Because I've color-coded it to make it a little bit more evident. All right, so if I know that these 2 areas are increasing, you know, a logical question might be why. You know, why is employment? Why am I spending more on employment? Perhaps my hypothesis is that rate increases are driving that spending up. It's either going to be rate or some form of volume, right? So it's either my pricing or my units must be going up. So I'm going to take a look at rate. To do that, within this particular set of data, I've got all these different data points available to me. You'll notice that rate is actually not one of them, but that's okay. I have a flexible tool. I can calculate what my hourly rate is. So this is the amount that I've spent. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a metric. Well, I think I'm going to create a metric. Try that again. I'm getting overly eager with my clicking. Okay, create metric. My metric editor pops up, and all right, my metric is called rate, and I know that hourly rates are simply a function of my fees that were billed divided by the hours that were billed. I'll save that, and now my chart easily updates to show me in this top section, this is what I was looking at before. This is my approved amount, so still that same trend, nothing has changed there. But in my bottom section, now I can line that up and see that in fact, the hourly rate, the average hourly rate that I paid in employment is up twice as much over what it was last year. But in fact, my M&A rate is not up. So my increase in rate overall is being driven by employment. And perhaps I want to isolate employment. So you know, a next logical step might be that I choose to take a look at employment only, and I'm going to break it down by law firm. So which of my law firms are driving this increase? So now I've isolated it to just be looking at employment, still the same data that I had before, but I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the breakdown of the law firms that billed me for employment, and very easily be able to see visually here that my increase in rate is coming from one particular law firm. Right, so, and I could go on with this example and demonstrate, you know, how then you might want to start looking at individual timekeeper rates, or perhaps you want to look at timekeeper levels. Is it a partner problem? Is it an associate problem? Perhaps it's not a problem at all. Perhaps once you look at the individual matter, it would be clear that that matter actually required or needed to have somebody billing at a much higher rate with that level of expertise. So the point that I want to make, and I'm going to go back to my slides here and leave the demo. The point that I want to make is that metrics, you know, metrics provide you with a number, but analysis is what enables you to figure out what to do to affect that number, to get closer to your goal. And having an ad hoc tool is essential in order to support that process. So I hope that was helpful and not confusing to bring in a little bit of analytics into this discussion about metrics. And then I think I do have time to speak about benchmarks, so I want to do that. At least just take a moment to talk about benchmark data. Within the counseling tool, we provide the ability to benchmark the metrics that are listed here on the left, hourly rates, total cost, duration, etc. Although by far the most commonly requested benchmarks relate to hourly rates. What you see on the right-hand side here is a screenshot of the output of the tool that we have to provide benchmarking data within CounselLink. So in other words, I have the ability, a CounselLink user has the ability to see what the range of rates are that are paid to lawyers working in a particular geography for a particular type of work, you know, whatever is a comparable sort of legal work to what they're trying to benchmark. Now, for purposes of today's webinar, I just want to discuss how benchmarks tie into the subject of metrics and KPIs. On one of my first slides, you may recall that I talked about the keys to a successful KPI program. And one of those keys that I didn't specifically address on that slide is that metrics need to have a target, some sort of a goal associated with it. And that target could be one of any number of different things. For instance, it might be a budget. It might be a percentage change relative to a prior period. In the example I gave a few minutes ago in that demo, I said that perhaps your goal was to have hourly rates only increasing a certain percentage. Or you may say that the goal is in relationship to an external benchmark, such as this sort of data. So if you decide to use average hourly rates, just staying with that example as one of your KPIs. Well, average hourly rate is your metric. That doesn't change. Your metric is average hourly rate. You're going to use your own data to calculate it. But the goal that you set might be that you say, I want my average hourly rate to be no higher than $400 an hour. It might be that I don't want my average hourly rate to be more than 2% higher than what I paid last year. Or it might be that you want your hourly rate to be within a certain range of the median of the benchmark. So benchmarks essentially in this context are one data point to help provide you with more information to set those goals. Okay, so that concludes the comments that I have related to metrics and analytics as it ties into it. I hope that this has been helpful, and I would be more than happy to help any of you advance in meeting your goals in using metrics and KPIs. My group consults regularly to help legal departments do a number of things on this subject. You know, it might be to choose the optimal metrics for your department. It might be to find the best way to surface those metrics in a dashboard or to visualize those metrics. And then also to help teach the analytic skills, you know, such as that analytic path that I demonstrated a moment ago, because it takes a different mindset than creating a report to go through that process of drilling into information and answering your questions. So please feel free to reach out to me if you would like to discuss any of these areas in more depth. And with that, I think I've got some time to take questions. I don't know, Megan, if there's anything that's come through that already, or if anybody has questions now.
So we have not seen any questions come through on the chat panel, so if you do have them, feel free to put them in, and we'll try to get to them as we see them. In the meantime, I just want to thank you, Chris, for that awesome presentation. I think metrics and analytics is a hot topic, and everyone struggles with how to best implement it. And thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. As Chris mentioned, we're all here to help. So if you would like someone to contact you to discuss managing metrics with CounselLink, please raise your hand using the hand raise button on your control panel, and we'll make sure someone reaches out to you shortly. And so if there are no questions, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much again for attending. Please don't forget to complete the survey that will pop up at the end of the session. Your feedback is really important, and it really does help us create good content for you in the future. So thank you to everyone, and have a great day.